Hey heroes, and welcome to another impossible episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins in the far-off 10th galaxy, on a peculiar planet known as Pop-Up. This world was home to many strange and dangerous creatures, making survival there particularly difficult. As such, the most intelligent species on Pop-Up, the green-skinned, semi-humanoid Papupian people, underwent a uniquely swift evolutionary process, until their entire species gained complete control over their own body on a molecular level, allowing them to instantaneously alter their shape, size, weight, and density. As a result, any individual Papupian could change into virtually anything they could imagine, with their transformations typically accompanied by a popping noise. This molecular control also allowed the Papupians to reproduce asexually, as each one could simply divide enough of their own cells and use them to form a second individual. After conquering their home planet's deadly creatures, the Papupians continued to develop, eventually linking their minds together to form a collective intelligence. While individuals were still capable of having their own personalities, each one was an extension of the same basic consciousness, and every Papupian was fully aware of what the others were experiencing at any given time. This also means that, unlike most intelligent species capable of speech, the Papupians do not traditionally have individual names, as they are intrinsically aware of who they are. Early in the Marvel Age, there was an incident in which a Papupian from a region of Pop-Up called Papupupu grew bored with life on his home planet and decided to take a vacation on Earth. Hungry from the journey and completely ignorant of human culture, including the very concept of currency, he ended up stealing a large sum of money from a New York City bank and using that to buy food. Perplexed by this peculiar invader and unable to stop him, the authorities soon contacted the Fantastic Four for help. But even with their superhuman powers, they were unable to apprehend the alien visitor, who intentionally avoided hurting them despite being thoroughly unimpressed by their unfriendly behavior. It was during this conflict that the Papupian gained the moniker that he would be known by on Earth, the Impossible Man. Furthermore, after the Impossible Man escaped from the FF, he finally realized that humans lacked the transformative abilities of Papupians, making him the most powerful being on Earth. He went on a bit of a rampage as he sought to amuse himself in an unfamiliar world. During his exploits, he also encountered a time-displaced hero from several years in the future, Miki Musashi, aka Turbo, and was briefly enamored with her, aiding her and her allies, the New Warriors, in a conflict with the man known as Dr. Yesterday. He got right back to his hijinks after that, pestering the Fantastic Four. However, Reed Richards came up with a brilliant plan to bring his rampage to an end. In short, Mr. Fantastic convinced the people of Earth to completely ignore the invader, just letting him do whatever he wanted while knowing that he wouldn't actually hurt anyone. Sure enough, with nobody paying any attention to him, the Impossible Man soon grew bored and left the planet of his own accord, declaring that the Earth would never again get any tourism business from him or any other Papupians. He returned to Pop-Up, but over the following few years, the Papupians grew increasingly bored with life. This came to a head when their community mind came to the conclusion that there was no need for a population of millions when each individual was simply an extension of the same being. And so in the midst of a conflict involving the Fantastic Four, the High Evolutionary, his planet Counter-Earth, and the World Eater Galactus, the Impossible Man impersonated Susan Storm Richards and tricked Galactus into consuming the planet Pop-Up. However, the Papupian people proved to be an unhealthy meal for Galactus, comparable to a human being eating a heavy meal of nothing but hot air, and the World Eater was stricken with a case of indigestion that nearly killed him. As the sole remaining Papupian with no world to call home, the Impossible Man decided to return to Earth with the Fantastic Four. Naturally, he quickly got back to his shape-shifting antics, causing chaos wherever he went. After learning of the existence of comic books, he visited the offices of Marvel Comics in New York and demanded that they publish a book starring him. However, Stan Lee informed the alien that when they adapted his previous exploits into an issue of Fantastic Four, they got letters from readers complaining that the Impossible Man looked too silly. This caused the Impossible Man to throw a temper tantrum until the FF arrived to defuse the situation, and the four convinced Stan to acquiesce to the Papupians' demand. Although Stan did immediately go back on that promise, declaring that Marvel Comics had no time to waste on ridiculous characters like the Impossible Man. In any event, the Impossible Man, or Impy as he was sometimes called, occasionally aided the FF during this trip to Earth, sometimes intentionally and other times less so. In one incident, supervillains Mentalo and the Fixer used a time-displaced Deathlock cyborg in a scheme to seize control of the US president by shooting him with a special control device in what would appear to be a normal assassination attempt. However, Nick Fury learned of this scheme, and Reed Richards had the Impossible Man act as a decoy for the president when Deathlock struck. Naturally, the Impossible Man was uninjured and unaffected by the control unit. In another incident, the Fantastic Four's headquarters, the Baxter Building, was taken over by the villainous trio, the Frightful Four, who captured their heroic rivals and sought to recruit a fourth member to fill the empty slot on their own team. While that was happening, the Impossible Man was too distracted by Earth television programming to really notice, but when the channel he was watching signed off for the night and went to a test pattern, he mistakenly believed that there was something wrong with the TV itself. In his misguided attempt to fix the issue, he tapped into the power supply for the Baxter Building itself and ended up cutting off the power to the restraints being used to hold the Fantastic Four, saving them purely by happenstance. Later, during a battle with an evil counterpart of Reed Richards from the High Evolutionaries Counter-Earth, Susan Storm was dazed and thrown from the top of the Baxter Building, and with some encouragement from the FF's ally, Thundra, the Impossible Man caught her, saving her life. However, he wasn't particularly interested in participating in the battle itself and wandered off to amuse himself elsewhere. While the FF were busy with a subsequent adventure, the Impossible Man continued his self-education of Earth with theatrical movies, which caught his attention when the Thing described them as being like TV but bigger. Shortly after he returned, the Baxter Building was attacked by a pair of powerful supervillains, Claw and the Molecule Man, who actually succeeded in sneaking up on the Impossible Man and knocking him unconscious. This was unprecedented, as nobody had ever actually bested a modern-day Papupian in combat before, and so after awakening, an embarrassed and annoyed Impossible Man launched a counterattack on the two villains. Suffice it to say, once they had his attention, the Impossible Man was able to counter anything that they could throw at him. In the ensuing battle, the Molecule Man ended up possessing Mr. Fantastic's body, and while the Impossible Man was amused by all of this and attempted to strike their foe down, the other members of the FF feared that he would seriously injure Reed in the process, and stopped him, much to Impy's annoyance. He decided to leave the FF to deal with the problem themselves, and stormed off. With his newfound interest in cinema, he traveled to Hollywood, where he continued to be a nuisance wherever he went. Although he did eventually grow bored with that and returned to visit the FF. Taking the form of a top hat, he accompanied Ben Grimm to an art show displaying the work of Ben's girlfriend, the blind sculptor Alicia Masters. While there, a group of villains called the Terrible Trio projected their minds into three of the sculptures, animating them and using them to attack the Thing. Caring more about her beloved than the statues, Alicia insisted that Ben fight back even if it meant destroying her work. Naturally, the Thing was ultimately victorious in the ensuing battle, defeating 2 of the 3 statues himself, while the Impossible Man unknowingly helped by distracting the 3rd of the terrible trio, breaking his concentration by transforming into a water balloon and popping on his head. After that conflict, the Impossible Man was inspired by Ben and Alicia's romance and decided to make one for himself, spawning an impossible woman, who sometimes was known as Impet. Taking further inspiration from Reed and Susan Richards, the impossible couple decided to start making children of their own as well. Of course, due to the mechanics of Papupian reproduction, the term children in this instance is relative. It might be more accurate to say that they cloned themselves to make more fully formed Papupians and simply willed them to behave and look as if they were children. Which, by the way, also means that each so-called child was already fully capable of duplicating as well. Suffice it to say, it didn't take long for Impy and Impet to spawn dozens upon dozens of these impossible kids. As the Papupian population exploded once again, the Impossible Man and Woman decided to establish a new planet Pop-Up and used the Fantastic Four's computer systems to locate an uninhabited world to settle on, one right in the heart of the Kree Empire. The impossible people departed the Earth once again, and the Thing was relieved that they would be someone else's problem, at least for a while. Naturally, they continued to reproduce, and within a few short years, the overall number of impossible kids reached a total of 4,682, most of whom did not have individual names, but some of the more unique children were given nicknames like Lil Imp, Impia, Ivana, Donald, and Adolf. At some point, the Impossible Man also spawned himself a canine companion named Ralph, the Impossible Dog. Meanwhile, there was an incident in which the Impossible Man started an argument with his wife in a misguided attempt to emulate human couples. Annoyed with him, the Impossible Woman left and intentionally obscured her thoughts from him, breaking their natural mind link. Initially thinking this was some sort of game, the Impossible Man returned to Earth and enlisted the aid of the superhuman private detective Jessica Drew, aka Spider-Woman, claiming that his wife had simply disappeared. Naturally, he proved to be a nuisance as he tagged along during the ensuing investigation and other exploits, although he did help her ward off the unwanted advances of a would-be admirer, and subsequently aided in the apprehension of a group of jewel thieves. In the end, the Impossible Man came clean to Spider-Woman about the argument that he'd had with his wife, and she helped him realize that he'd unintentionally hurt Impet's feelings. Of course, Impy didn't initially think that was possible, as under normal circumstances, Papupians can't really be hurt by anything, but the impossible couple were attempting to emulate the full range of human emotions, allowing her to actually experience such feelings. In any event, while all of that was happening, the Impossible Woman was in Drew's office, talking to her receptionist/associate, Lindsay McCabe. And so Impy and Impet ultimately reunited and reconciled, and even offered to stay with Jessica and help her with future cases. However, Drew convinced the couple that Ben Grimm would be upset if they worked with her instead of him, and the Impossibles left again. As time passed, this generation of Papupians grew increasingly distinct as individuals, and while many of them were still incredibly similar to one another, they no longer shared the same kind of group mind as the Papupians of old. As such, they began to disagree on which one of them should lead their people, with each one voting for themselves, and they ultimately decided to settle the matter with a scavenger hunt. Each participating Papupian picked a planet to plunder for promising prizes, and the Impossible Man, of course, picked the Earth. He started his hunt by stealing the Xavier Mansion in upstate New York, which naturally put the X-Men on his trail, and the mutant team pursued him as he gathered other items including Nick Fury's eye patch, Kazar's saber-toothed tiger Zabu, the Fantastic Four's Fantasticar, the Wasp's wardrobe of costumes, the iconic window from Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum, and what appears to be the Millennium Falcon. The X-Men finally caught up to him while he was launching another attack on the offices of Marvel Comics in an attempt to abduct Stan Lee, who wasn't even there at the time, since by that point he'd turned his attention to Hollywood. In the end, the X-Men realized that the Impossible Man never actually meant any harm and convinced him to abandon his game and return everything that he had stolen. In the midst of this, they were accosted by a coalition of representatives of alien races who were similarly annoyed by the antics of the Impossible Man and other Papupians and demanded retribution. Fortunately, the X-Men were allies with the magistrix of the Shi'ar Empire, Lilandra Neramani, who brokered peace by declaring that the Papupians would undo any damage that they had done. She also convinced the other aliens that seeking vengeance by trying to start a war with the Papupians would be an incredibly terrible idea. After putting everything back where it came from, the Impossible Man later returned to the X-Mansion, this time encountering the new mutants, and got into a shape-shifting contest with their alien member, the Technarch Warlock. The Impossible Man actually lost that game when Warlock demonstrated the power to change color, an ability that Papupians evidently lacked. I will note that the Impossible Man did change colors while transforming during his very first trip to Earth, but it's been theorized that he lost that power after the original planet Pop-Up was destroyed, limiting him to green and purple. The Impossible Man later encountered the Silver Surfer in space and attempted to befriend the Dour Traveler. He secretly followed the Surfer for a time, and after learning of Thanos' plan to eliminate half of all life in the universe, confronted him again, fearing that the Surfer's seriousness would prevent him from defeating Thanos. Impy attempted to convince the spacefaring hero to lighten up and develop a sense of humor, and the Silver Surfer begrudgingly agreed to try. The Impossible Man was satisfied with this, and the Surfer even cracked a joke after he left, surprising even himself. Impy and his wife later decided to take the entire Impossible family on a vacation to Earth, and while most of the Fantastic Four were away on an unrelated adventure at the time, the Impossible Man amused himself by pestering the likes of Spider-Man, the Sorcerer Supreme, Doctor Strange, and the brutal vigilante Frank Castle, better known as the Punisher. Meanwhile, the Impossible Woman and one of her more serious children, Impia, had an encounter with the cosmic hero Quasar and the insane immortal prankster Madcap. She subsequently crashed a fashion show being put on by the Avenger Janet Van Dyne and attended by her allies Susan Storm and Jennifer Walters. Wanting to get involved in the fun, Impet transformed herself into a dress that was then modeled by Susan Storm, revealing herself on stage before popping away, much to Sue's embarrassment and frustration. Finding her antics amusing, She-Hulk suggested that they let the Impossible Woman help backstage, but the alien wound up destroying various outfits in her attempt to fix them. To make up for this, she simply spawned an additional 5 Impossible Women of various sizes to recreate and model the cut-up clothes. As for the Impossible Kids, a number of them traveled to Latveria and shrank down, attempting to claim Dr. Doom's armor as their clubhouse. But Doom cleverly manipulated them by making his suit seem like a terribly boring place to be, tricking the Impossible Children into leaving and pestering Iron Man instead. The Impossible family then all traveled to Dizzy World, where the Impossible Man grew to gargantuan size to play a round of golf using the spaceship Earth attraction as a giant golf ball. But when said ball landed on the Impossible Woman, she decided that the trip was over, and the family reconvened to leave the Earth together, although on the way back they swung by the planet Satriani in the Andromeda Galaxy, where they showed off pictures of their vacation to the Skrulls. Soon afterwards, they realized that they were missing one of their children and returned to Earth to search for them. Hearing rumors of a green shapeshifter, the Impossible Woman investigated the dinosaur-infested Savage Land, where her search led her to a Skrull named Samuel that she ended up adopting into the family. The Impossible Man meanwhile pestered Daredevil in Hell's Kitchen and searched adjacent realms like Asgard and the Microverse, but finding no sign of his lost child. As it turns out, the missing Impossible Kid was in Manhattan's Alphabet City, where he wound up headlining a rock band called Impy and the Wimpy Geeks. After finally finding him and inadvertently starting a riot at the venue he was playing, the Impossible family left the Earth once again and went on their own intergalactic singing tour. Of course, the Impossible Man continued to find reasons to return to Earth and amuse himself, like when he caused a riot at the Bar with No Name by transforming into a deck of cards with an extra ace of spades in it. When the longtime Avengers ally Rick Jones married his girlfriend Marlo Chandler, the Impossible Man took it upon himself to send invitations to supervillains like the Wizard, the Absorbing Man, Mr. Hyde, and the Living Laser, as well as representatives from the Kree and Skrull empires. But with the likes of the Hulk and the Silver Surfer also in attendance, the unexpected guests were encouraged to behave. When 3 of the Impossible Kids grew into a disaffected trio known as the Impossible Slackers, Impy decided to teach them discipline by having them join his old friends, the New Mutants. However, by this point that team had been reorganized into a paramilitary strike team known as X-Force, and the Impossible Man's antics greatly annoyed their grizzled leader, Cable. So much so that Cable eventually acquiesced to Impy's request in the hopes that he would just leave them alone. The Impossible Slackers were initially uninterested in joining any of X-Force's activities, but ultimately aided the group in a battle with the giant monster Baracus the Calinator. In the end, they were inspired by Cable's heroism and began modeling themselves after him, leaving the planet to defend the innocent elsewhere in the universe. Now, I will note that while all of this was going on, in a far-off, distant cosmos, there was a similarly impossible entity, a fifth-dimensional imp known as Mr. Mxyzptlk. He generally preferred to pester various versions of the prototypical superhero Superman in that distant cosmos or DC multiverse, but on at least one occasion has taken on a form similar to that of the Impossible Man and menaced a version of the Fantastic Four. This led some to speculate that the two were actually the same entity, but then there was an incident in which, while inside the dimensional interface that he passed through between pops, the Impossible Man encountered Mr. Mxyzptlk, who he referred to as Mixed Pickles. The two realized that while they weren't actually the same race, they did have a lot in common, and came up with a plan to trade opponents, making a rule that the ones they chose could not occupy the same dimension during their game. Still wanting him to lighten up, the Impossible Man had Mxyzptlk bring the Silver Surfer to Metropolis in the distant cosmos. Meanwhile, the Impossible Man brought Superman to the Marvel Universe and tricked him into believing that he had been sent to his destroyed homeworld of Krypton, where Impy impersonated the Super Skrull and attacked, threatening to conquer and enslave the planet. However, when the phony Kryptonians were nearly injured in the ensuing battle, the disguised Impossible Man made sure to save them, and Superman was able to see through the illusion. In the end, the Impossible Man revealed himself and confessed that he was jealous of Mixed Pickles for having a much more consistent opponent, since nobody in his native reality wanted to play with him anymore. Furthermore, when Impy learned that Mxyzptlk was far more willing to endanger innocent civilians with his antics, he ended up opposing him himself, leading to a battle between the two alien shapeshifters. In the end, the Impossible Man tricked Mr. Mxyzptlk into bringing Superman back to the DC universe while the Silver Surfer was still there, thereby breaking the rules they had set at the beginning of the game. And so the Impossible Man was declared victorious over his DC equivalent, and everyone ultimately returned to their home dimensions. Later, the Impossible Kids grew up and all went out on their own, leaving their parents alone and distraught. The Impossible Man and Impossible Woman returned to Earth and created a legion of impossible clones in the Baxter Building, but their downheartedness caused these new Papupians to have darker senses of humor than their progenitors, and 4 of them even attempted to eliminate and replace the Fantastic Four. In the confusion, Impy and Impet abducted the Richards' children, Franklin and Valeria, but Reed and Sue were ultimately able to help the impossible couple, except that all children eventually leave the nest, and the impossible chaos calmed down once again. Of course, there have been other instances of the Impossible Man and his family popping up to pester the Fantastic Four and other heroes of Earth over the years, not all of which we have time to touch on today. In one incident, the Impossible Man had a bad case of the hiccups, causing him to lose control of his transformations, until the thing finally cured him with a well-timed startle. In another, he briefly merged the green and red Hulks into a single composite entity. Meanwhile, although most of the thousands of impossible kids departed to other dimensions, some have continued to pop up since then. For example, when Impy's more studious son, Adolf the Impossible Boy, exhibited traits that were normally foreign to Papupians like anxiety and introversion, the Impossible Man had Adolf enroll in the FF's special school, the Future Foundation, where he befriended his fellow student, Luna Maximoff, and learned to moderate his negative emotions. As for what's next for the Impossible Man and his family, well, I suppose where they're concerned, anything is possible. In any event, that's all the time I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members, all of whom help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in the special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!